It's hard to believe, but 2022 is almost done. It seems like only yesterday I kicked off the year with the plan of looking at the nVidia Maxwell 2 series, the earliest Geforce cards that support DX12 features and have decent performance in Vulkan. After having tested the GTX 960, 970, 980 Ti and a couple of Quadros, the only gaps remaining are ones I felt like I could live with. Except, perhaps, for this one. The GTX 980 launched in 2014, long before the 980 Ti and Titan X. As a flagship of its day, the 980 had a whole lot to offer. As well as the aforementioned API support, the 980 gave an extra gigabyte of VRAM over its predecessor, finally bringing it in line with AMD's R9 290X from the previous year. As well as a straight-up instructions per clock improvement over Kepler, meaning for 10% more performance on over 800 fewer cores, the trick up Maxwell's sleeve was overclocking. Higher-end models of the GTX 980, like the Asus Matrix Platinum card I have here, have somewhat over-engineered power delivery and cooling to help in this, and it has a 126 MHz core overclock from the factory as a result. The test bed, as usual, is my moderately priced gaming PC featuring an overclocked Ryzen 5 5600G at 4.6 GHz and 16 gigs of DDR4 3600 RAM. God of War has had a couple of updates since launching earlier this year, mainly to add tech like FSR2 upscaling, but in terms of performance it seems to have remained fairly consistent. Considering the GTX 970 scored about 54 FPS at 1080 original, and the 980 Ti recorded 70 FPS with textures turned up a little, it's not a huge surprise that the GTX 980 falls slap bang in the middle, at 62 FPS on average. Turning up to high isn't out of the question, with resulting averages of about 54, but I did have to drop texture resolution to original to keep within the 4GB frame buffer limit. Arguably, Final Fantasy VII Remake wasn't my best choice of title to test this year, and I should probably have figured that out by now. It turns out to have been a fairly interesting game to test, even unmodded, but not for the right reasons. I run the game at 1080 high with FPS limited to 120, which are the maximum settings within the game. Some GPUs ignore that limiter and just soft cap at 60 FPS, but Maxwell 2 doesn't seem to follow those rules. The GTX 980 doesn't hit the 120 limit, but it does push past 60 to a very solid 80 FPS. Like most of the older GPUs I've tested, there's the occasional hitch in cutscenes, but none of the sub-30 dips seen on the GTX 970. Elden Ring likewise has a 60 FPS cap, but it's not that hard to test older GPUs here anyway. At 1080 max settings, even the 980 Ti couldn't manage 60 FPS. The 980 hits a pretty solid 50 with 1% lows of 37, which I can't say is unplayable. My standard test run is to sneak around and clear this camp, and then usually die at the hands of the big shieldy bloke at the end. This wasn't the first time I killed him, but it was the easiest. Still, locking at 60 should only need you to drop settings to high, maybe medium at worst. As I'm sure most of us know by now, Forza Horizon 5's canned benchmark doesn't really reflect normal open-world gameplay, but it does test the GPU about as much as the game ever will. The GTX 980 runs rather nicely at 1080 high at over 100 FPS in free roaming, but the benchmark run brings that crashing down to earth, averaging just above 60 FPS. Again, this fits nicely between the other two Maxwell GPUs. The 980 Ti is about 10% better, the 970 about 15% slower. Guardians of the Galaxy was booted off my roster a while ago because of how inconsistent the canned benchmark is, and how the first level is so much more intensive than the benchmark would lead you to believe. Another anomaly of the game is performance with Maxwell cards. I found in the 970 and 980 Ti videos that rolling back to older drivers, specifically 471.11, but I'm sure others work as well, was necessary in order to get normal gameplay from these cards. I thought I'd give the 980 a go with the latest drivers to see how it proceeded, and sure enough it still plays like crap. If you roll back to 471.11 you should get a playable experience, though again the benchmark doesn't really reflect this, and I've already given up trying to find a good spot in game that represents average performance. And that brings me to the curious case of Halo Infinite. The Xbox flagship title doesn't perform well on older architectures, but both the 970 and 980 Ti could obtain manageable frame rates at low settings, and perhaps with some application of resolution scaling. Well, something's gone wrong. Somehow, something has screwed up compatibility with Maxwell 2. The indoor multiplayer games I tested were fine, averaging close to 70 FPS at 1080 low. The campaign ran at about 6 to 7 FPS. Thinking back to my experience in Guardians of the Galaxy, I tried rolling the drivers back, this time to 512.15, which is the set I successfully used on the 980 Ti. And lo, it is healed. Averages break 50 FPS outdoors at 1080, and with some further tweaks it could probably manage to hit 60. I don't know who's to blame for this, whether the last big Halo update ruined Maxwell compatibility, or nVidia made a mistake in the drivers, but I hope it gets fixed soon. Another game whose updates threw my testing out of whack this year, the 1.6 patch for Cyberpunk 2077 changed the settings for the medium preset. With the new preset dialed in, the game runs at a playable but sluggish 34 FPS with lows of 25. Adding the recently implemented FSR 2.1 gives roughly a 50% boost in performance, with a small drop in image quality and a few artifacts around moving objects. I never took the time to make a note of the settings of the original medium preset, but manually tweaking everything down to medium, or high if medium was unavailable, saw about 10% higher averages. Web swinging in Spider-Man Remastered is a surprisingly excellent experience on the GTX 980. At very high settings, my run from Fisk Tower to Empire State via Broadway and back again scored a shade under 60 FPS on average, and with the exception of swinging around the top of the tower, things were pretty smooth. You could probably sacrifice a couple of quality settings or use some resolution scaling if you're sensitive to lower frame rates, but if you're looking for a bug in GPU for Spider-Man, I think we have a contender. My walk through Valentine was similar to NYC, if not a little smoother. Red Dead Redemption 2 did require pushing the quality slider to the middle to reach this FPS, and again, a few more nudges could help bring this up to 60 should you so desire. The art direction of this title holds up well, but if you're a critical sort, you might notice a drop in detail and loss of tessellation. Some people have suggested I might use the optimized settings established by, I forget who, was it DF or Hardware Unboxed? Either way, Rockstar settings menus are a nightmare as it is, and I'd rather spend as little time in there as possible. As probably the last time I'll test Call of Duty Vanguard for a GPU video, it was with a degree of solemnity with which I dispatched noobs and AFK players in FFA and Team Deathmatch. I even resisted the temptation to teabag. Averaged across 3 matches, the 980 scored a very acceptable 70 FPS at 1080 medium. Lows weren't too bad either, though you could always turn on some FSR or drop some settings to keep things running a little smoother. FSR 1 isn't my preferred upscaler, but if you're less picky than me, you can expect averages over 100 FPS on most maps. That is, if anyone still plays Vanguard. On that subject, let me know in the comments if you want me to swap Vanguard out for Modern Warfare 2 in 2023. I don't like giving Activision money, to be honest, but if enough people are interested, I'll pick up a key from somewhere. As usual, I tested Fortnite in 2 setups, both in DX12, but one at high settings and epic view distance for those who like to admire the game's shaders and effects as they snipe, and the other with everything but view distance dropped to low for those who want the optimum high frame rate experience. The 980 can actually deliver on both fronts. The high settings option comes close to 80 FPS on average, with lows close to 60, whereas the so-called Pro settings reaches about 200 FPS and lows above 120. This is my first time playing the new version of Warzone, and it's going to take some getting used to. In some ways it kind of feels like a knockoff of itself. I don't know. Anyway, I ran a test at 1080 balance to remain somewhat close to the 1080 normal I used to test this tier of GPU with in Warzone 1, and saw a little under 60 FPS on average. This difference could probably be overcome with some resolution scaling, but if you'd rather hit the nuclear option, then using the lowest quality preset only adds about 7 FPS. Apex Legends works a treat on the GTX 980. If you're partial to higher quality graphics, this GPU can still put out 100 FPS even at 1080 high, with 1% lows still well above 60. If you have a 144Hz display, then there's the option to drop settings to low or off, and this will see averages above 130 most of the time, and 1%'s over 100. Well, who'd have thought it? Mr. I don't test GTA 5 because it's too old and everyone knows how it performs already. He's testing 2015's GTA 5 on a 2014 GPU. Well, call it an experiment. According to my poll, 57% of you say I should test in this game, but I want to see how many of you are actually still interested. At 1080 with settings at very high across the board and advanced settings turned up, the 980 can put out an excellent 86 FPS average, dipping below 60 slightly when there's a substantial amount of vegetation on screen. Some would describe the non-TI GTX 980 as being the card the 970 should have been, with a less misleading amount of VRAM and an unlocked GM204 GPU at its heart. I picked this one up for a little under £100, which is about £20 to £25 more than the going rate on a 970 now, and depending on the title, the 980 scores between 15 and 30% higher than that card on average. Is it worth the price difference? I'd argue yes. The 970 has plenty going in its favour, from relatively low power draw for a card of its age, to a very attractive price for the performance you get. But as time goes on, VRAM becomes more of a premium commodity, and I don't think gamers in 2023 will regret spending the extra few of their local currency units to get a true 4GB GPU. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.